BLOCKCHANCE 2021.
Please welcome to the stage Fabian Vogelsteller.
Hello, can you hear me? Does it work? Yeah. All right. So I have 30 minutes to walk you through what we believe the future of Web3 will look like. And I do have to start out with the problems. Like coming from like this very emotional introduction we just had about Rise, we also need to understand where we are, what we need to change, and how do we change it. So what's holding back blockchain adoption? I think this is a question probably many of you already had because we are in this space now since like 10 plus years. And it's still kind of like, it's like known, but do people really use blockchain on a daily basis? And the answer is for trading, right? Or maybe some DeFi, but not necessarily on a real like daily basis. So the thing is, one of the missing pieces in blockchain that we basically are having is that, or that we're missing is the identity, right? So if you look at the latest blockchain identity, kind of like how we envision that, we could like look at websites like SuperRare, or Rareable in this case. Is it better? Is it better? Hello? Is it a difference? There's a difference now? Okay. All right, so, okay, so if you look at websites like Rareable, right? This is kind of like how we envision like Web3 profiles currently look like, or this is how they look like, right? So we have some username and some account, and we also have an address, which you can see here, a laser pointer there. The problem with this is, on the blockchain it looks like this, right? So you look at Etherscan, and you see a random key. In this case, it's very sophisticated because he even has an ENS address that you can see here. So you can even see transactions that he did, or like when he issues something and you see his ENS name and so on. But the problem is still just a key. So imagine the future social media, decentralized social media, right? So we have a beautiful decentralized social media. We have like even an ENS name attached to it, and it's like all looking great. The problem is that account would be controlled by this. It would be controlled by a private key. The problem of a private key is that you can easily lose it, right? So would you want to base your public identity or even like secret identity on something that you can never lose, that you can never change, and that you can never reveal to anyone, right? Because otherwise they have control over your identity. Problem is, this is exactly not how we can create anything which has to do with identity on blockchain, and this is exactly the current state of things. So when we are looking at this example with the ENS name that we had like at this NFT artist, problem here is as well, if you want to change your key, you point your ENS name to a different address. Now on Etherscan, all the assets you issued don't say anymore n.eth issued them, but now it says whatever random public key it was. So it's very hard to tell, to keep like a consistent identity over time, issuing assets from that identity. So this is the big problem we're having, and this is exactly why identity hasn't taken off yet in blockchain, right? And this is the essence of NFTs and artists and creations, right? So the actual truth is, and we should realize this by now, you shouldn't store anything on keys. Because if you store it on keys, you store it on a password that you can't lose and can't change. And that's the blockchain user experience that we have today, and this is exactly why blockchain adoption is so hard or hasn't really happened, because it's very complicated, very cumbersome, and very high risky because you can easily lose things. But we have something better with smart contracts. We can actually make smart contract-based accounts that solves all of these problems. Let's come to another problem, right? So identity is a problem. Tokens are a problem too, at least in the current form as they are. So let's start with like generic ERC20. You all heard about ERC20. It's a standard I created in 2015. And there's also other versions, 223, 777, and so on, modifications and improvements on top of this. So the big problem we have here, we don't have really proper metadata. Back in the day, we defined a symbol and a name that you can attach to a token, but you can't easily like add an icon or add an issue or add like reference a website or whatever. So you're very limited of what you can put into token contract itself. When it comes to 721, that's the standard behind all the NFTs. The metadata is quite limited, right? So you have a URI that you're referencing from your ID. And that can be obviously sitting on IPFS, and if it sits on IPFS, you have a hash, and that hash is something that you can reference, and ideally, the file can't change because you can always reference back to the hash. But you can also store that on wherever, right? You can also store it on Google Drive, and then you have a problem. The other third big problem of tokens is that we don't have a generic way to inform another smart contract that he actually received an asset. So if I do a transfer with an ERC20 and I'm sending it to a DEX smart contract, this DEX knows nothing about that. I'm only updating the internal storage of that ERC20 token. So I'm just changing the balance internally. The DEX has no way. So in order to really tell the DEX that you received the token, you actually have to approve the DEX as an operator, and then you call the DEX, and the DEX has to do a transfer and pull the assets basically in, you're calling transfer from. And that's how the DEX can obviously do these things. So there were some smart people after us, after 2015, that thought, hey, let's improve on this. And the reason actually why we didn't add this calling, because it was too complicated at the time, and we first wanted to standardize a token in the first place. But other people like 223, 721 also, Jordi with 777, they thought about, hey, why we don't call the other smart contract that you're interacting with, right? And that's great. So basically, different standards have different functions. So one calls it tokens received, the other calls it token received, the other call it 721 token received, which makes it very easy to implement, right? Because if I'm a DEX, I just have to implement 3 functions. Problem is, what if there's a new standard that comes a 4th function? It gets complicated. That's especially complicated if I want to have a smart contract-based account, right? Because my smart contract-based account should be long-living, and I obviously want to know, any future assets that's incoming. So to summarize, we have no proper metadata on tokens itself. We have pretty limited metadata on NFTs itself, and we have no generic way to call smart contracts, which is the main way of how you use tokens, right? You send them from addresses to contracts to DEXs to whatever, right? So the good thing is we fixed this all. And so far, are you following me? Is this too technical? I mean, it's technology. We're in a blockchain conference, right? So. All right, so how do we fix that? We fixed it actually with something we call universal profiles. And we have nicely in emoji a unicorn icon that everybody's now using for that. So the thing is, universal profiles is like a smart contract-based account. And what do we would like to have if you have a smart contract-based account, right? We would like it to work like Peace, right? You can do the same thing. You can interact on the blockchain. You can transfer things. You can talk to other smart contracts. You should be able to deploy smart contracts. And you obviously should be able to hold assets. The good thing is that's exactly what smart contracts can do. But we also would like to have upgradable security. So we not just want to rely on one password that we saw before, right? This number string, but we want something that can change over time. Ideally, users don't want to pay for gas. I mean, one of the big hurdles of blockchain adoption is, hey, here, create your MetaMask, write down 12 words, and now go get some Ether, right? And that's like your user experience with a D app. Because you need to pay for transaction fees. Makes sense, the network needs that, but can we somehow hide that from people? We ideally would like to have changeable information. So you have an account that actually looks like something and not like this ENS entry, random key we saw on Etherscan, right? You would like to have a profile picture and other things. And you obviously, ideally, would like to interact with incoming assets, maybe treat them differently, maybe reject some, maybe reroute some assets. But if we have a smart contract account, ideally it's long-lasting. Long-lasting means we can't really change it over time. And obviously it should be extensible, because if we have anything that people want to use in the long run, we can't just make up everything you can do with it in the early days and then hope that it will last forever. So that's exactly what the ES75 account standard solves. And rather than approaching it from, hey, we have this cool app here and it's going to change everything and please use that app, we are approaching it from a standards perspective, because that's what I've been doing the last few years in blockchain, I guess. Because when you create a standard, when you really make it open and unbiased, then these powerful things can happen that we have seen in the blockchain space. I mean, ERC20 is probably a good example for that, because it's kind of changed everything, and everything we have today is kind of somehow related to tokens or came out of tokens. So creating a standard is actually really the right basis for fixing these problems, rather than just making an app or just making a custom smart contract and hope that people jump on it. So the nice thing, it fits also really well to 725 up, right? You get the joke, universal profile. So the thing is, you're still following, it's getting now more technical. So I will show you a little bit how that works under the hood, and this is the relevant thing for developers. And I keep it still high level. So if you have a smart contract-based account, you have a smart contract, that's your address, right? That thing can't change because it is your address, right? If you want to redeploy your smart contract, you have a different address. It's a problem if you're issuing things, if you're a creative person, if you're a public persona, or even if you're just holding assets on that address, right? You can't change it. So that's the core piece, and it can't change. But this core piece has one owner, one controlling address. But the good thing is, in smart contract land, smart contract can talk to each other. So we can have another smart contract being the controller of that one, which gives us flexibility of how we control it. And that piece is upgradable, obviously. So whenever somebody comes up with an even better way of doing this, you could just change it, right? So the thing is, your key manager or your profile in this sense can be controlled by a key, but it can also be controlled by many keys or different devices, which makes using your account a lot easier, because you now can use it from different devices in different ways. How many people do export their private keys from MetaMask to other MetaMasks? Not a lot of people. So that means you have two wallets, right? Two accounts that you rather don't touch. But the really good benefit of having a smart contract that controls access, that you can actually also accept relay transactions. So if you're the camel, right, you could just sign with your key, not paying any transaction fees. You just sign a message saying, I want to do a transfer. You send it to the bear, and the bear could send it to your key manager, and then the whole thing executes on chain. So someone else can pay for your gas. In this case, the bear pays. But the bear can also be a transaction relay service, some kind of company that does this for a business, asking you for a monthly fee, or lets you watch some ads or whatever to use that blockchain. So now we can completely change the onboarding. And obviously, we can also subsidize this and find other ways to make it easy, right? For the first users, it shouldn't be, hey, here, 12 words, and go to an exchange, KYC, and then come back, right? It should be click, go in, done. The other thing is, you can actually react to incoming assets, because the way of how this smart contract gets informed when there's a token coming in, basically can delegate it to an external, also upgradable smart contract, and therefore you can either reject certain tokens, or you could allow certain tokens. But even more important, you can actually write these tokens that you received into your profile's key value store. That means you can have a decentralized account where everything that's related to this account is readable from the smart contract directly. That means you can literally build a website just reading from smart contracts, IPF, and whatever storage people use, and you build up the whole profile in total, including all of its relations to whatever vault or assets he owns. That really truly makes a decentralized account. But the good thing is, it can actually look like a Web2 account. So it can look like something cool, even though under the hood something technical, right? So for example, this website doesn't have a database. So all of this data, for example, pictures, text, is like stored on IPFS, could be stored anywhere, really. And all of its creations, these NFTs here from Artifact, are also related from the smart contract. So there's no Etherscan API or anything you're calling to just like build up this website. That makes a truly, decentralized blockchain-based account system that we call universal profiles. So how do we fix tokens? I think one of the problems is that people who have been in this space building things mostly just use whatever's already adopted, because they, obviously for them it's easier to just build something extra on top, and it's already working with MetaMask and all the other tools. There's not a lot of people who come in and like say, hey, it's shit, let's fix it. I do that, so. But I also already started it, so I guess I need to do that. Yeah, so this was the 2015. So we basically rethought all of these token standards that we have, and I kind of like threw out the bad and fixed the good and made it right. It's in a way like a 2.0 version of these standards. So ERC20 we call LSP7, and ERC721 we call LSP8, and they are kind of like altered versions of those. And the big difference between these two is one is for transferring amounts and the other is for transferring singular units that have an ID. So by the way, LSP is called Lukso Standards Proposals. So ERC20, so one thing we did is basically we named those things very similar, right? I mean, they're both tokens, right? One for quantities, the other for unique IDs. You obviously don't want to have like kind of different functions that developers can't remember. So the really big difference in this is that LSP8 has an extra token IDs off, so you can like get all the token IDs of a specific address, and you check a bit different, like for example, token owner off. And the transfer functions are literally the same, except that in one you transfer amounts, and the other you transfer an ID. There's an extra force parameter that I will explain in a little bit. And there's also this standard called ERC1155, which allows you to do batch transfers, blah, 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 be more cheap on the blockchain and so on. I mean, we also added that in a way, because you also have batch transfers. That means you can simply transfer lots of tokens at once to lots of different people. The thing this is what like this makes this a bit more flexible on the metadata is that we have ERC725, which is the standard that proposed 2017. That actually literally is two standards. It's one called ERC725Y, which is a key value store, and one is called ERC725X, which is the execution part. And together, that could be an account, but you can also use it separately. So the tokens use 725Y, which is basically this get and set data function. So you can set arbitrary bytes, byte 32 to bytes, key value store, and you can read it. That literally allows us to add anything to a token, same as we can add anything to a profile. Obviously, we need to standardize now a bunch of how we write this and how we read it. But this allows us, for example, to have like the token symbol and the token name in this key value store. And now you can define arbitrary logic of how this could be changed if you want to change it, or how certain things can be updated. When it comes to the NFTs, we also want to be able to represent these metadata in a more complex way. And for example, the second part here is you can actually reference each token ID to something we call a JSON URL, which is basically by design a string of bytes built in such a way that you have already the hash function, the hash, and the URL included. That means you can actually store your metadata wherever you want, and there's always a hash already written into the smart contract. So you know that you get the right file if you download it, no matter where it's stored. But the other thing is also you can actually map every token ID, which in our case, by the way, is byte 32, so a lot more flexible of what you use as a token ID. And you can map it to another smart contract. So you could make an NFT that has its own metadata smart contract being updated in whatever custom way you want. That kind of like creates three types of NFTs, right? One is just like a smart contract representing an NFT with amounts. The second is smart contract where each NFT has a unique ID. And the third is where each ID has its own smart contract with its own whatever logic or metadata. And you can even make a mixture of those. And the other thing that we need in order to solve this problem that we saw before, for example, with these different functions that you want to call, is something we call LSP1, which is called universal receiver. And that kind of solves this transfer. So if I want to transfer a token, I can basically call the universal receiver function. And because it's one function name, it's easily implementable by a account, for example, right? So I have that one function, it doesn't need to change, I don't need to add another function to receive any assets in the future. And because we have like this type ID in data, we can basically invent all kinds of new standards and ways of how we call this. And your profile, because it can update the way it reacts, you saw that external smart contract before, that was on the bottom right. Because we can upgrade this, we can change the way we act to incoming assets. So this means if you have an account, you, for example, could in the future say, okay, I have now these 2 extra vaults, and every time I get those type of tokens, I want to route them into this vault, and other tokens I want to route into this vault. So I could like automate how I react to incoming assets and just change that over time. There's a fourth function, and this is also probably one of the biggest problems we have in blockchain. Let's guess how much, like billions of dollars were sent into nowhere in the last few years, because people either mistyped addresses or, maybe copy and pasted the wrong address and whatnot. So these token standards, because they are built in conjunction with universal profiles and with these new standards, they by default can only be sent to smart contracts that actually implement the universal receiver. That also means you cannot send them by default to just keys. Because as we heard before, you shouldn't store stuff on keys, right? It's not a safe way to do so. But obviously, if you know what you're doing, right, you could use the force, and then you can obviously send it wherever you want, right? So, so the big question is probably, hey, here, you made all of this cool stuff up, blah, blah, blah. And how do people adopt this now? Because everybody's already using MetaMask, right? And the whole Ethereum space is using ERC20 and 721 and so on. Actually, a big answer is Lukso. So the thing is, we are building a new blockchain, which is also an EVM blockchain, that's not only for the purpose of like the standards adoption. Actually, the main reason is cultural and community. So in fact, there's this whole notion of, hey, here, one blockchain to rule them all, and I guess there's probably some people believe Bitcoin is that thing. But actually, each blockchain is more like a country, and you attract a certain community to your network that builds then within this country things that are related to them. So culture and community is the main reason why we started Lukso. Obviously, there's a rational reason as well. We do need more space on the blockchain, and resource availability is obviously on Bitcoin and Ethereum a big problem. Any other blockchain, there's just a lot of transaction people want to do, and blockchains are full. So having more transaction availability also with a newer architecture makes sense. And it does make standard adoption easier. Because when you're building a Lukso, you can obviously just deploy your 721 and you can do it all the old way. But it doesn't make a lot of sense if you want to be compatible to the other things that people are building. So if you go into this new network, you have a clear incentive to make it the right way because you want to be compatible to your users and other things. So in its essence, it's an EVM blockchain. That means it's an Ethereum virtual machine blockchain. So it works like the Ethereum network as well. It's using the same protocol, but it actually uses the Casper consensus from ETH2. So it's a separate network using the ETH2 Casper consensus. And we initially running this with a single sharded system. So what we have been over the last year is actually building almost the same thing like Ethereum does, obviously built on top of the same building blocks, but in a slightly different way. In our way we have, and that's a drawing someone did from our community, without knowing, explaining our network really well in this nice picture here. So we have basically a consensus chain that we call Vanguard that runs the proof of stake consensus. So that's Casper FFG. That means that you can have 200, 300,000 validators actually running the network. That's not delegated proof of stake, that's real decentralized proof of stake. We have a execution chain that we call Pandora. And we made these names up before we got that picture from the guy. So it's just a coincidence that it looks like this as well. And this is initially a single sharded system, but we are loosely coupling this through something called the Lukso orchestrator, so that we can actually easily add more shard chains in the future. A big problem that needs to be solved in that regard is cross-shard transactions. But basically, that is a setup that is similar to what like Ethereum is building as well right now with their merge execution chain that they want to build, but they are tightly coupling it together. That means for them extending extra shards not that easily because they're like really like melting it together while we are loosely coupling this. That's, for example, the Pandora shard chain running, and this is the beacon chain running. And the idea of this network is really to be for this new creative economy, new creative lifestyle. You know, you can call it metaverse. We call it new creative economy. You can see it here. That shirt is like 2 years old, so we already thought about that a little bit. So the idea is really it can be this thing for the NFTs 2.0. That's these new token standards because they are far more extensible. You can do a lot more things. Also with like universal profiles, you have identity, you have provenance. You can easily see who created what, and people do care about these accounts because they will have followers and ratings and something they use over time, which obviously is not going to happen with your random key tied to an ENS name. Something we talked on our white paper about years ago is cultural currencies, and that's the idea of having tokens that represent communities or like, you know, maybe given out by a VIP, a star, an influencer or whatever. And that's new ways of how we will engage as human society, like with different communities that we feel attracted to or we feel belonging to. And I guess blockchain-based social media will be a thing, especially when you have universal profiles. So you can literally decentralize the way of how we do this right now. That obviously ties nicely into the metaverse because having a blockchain-based decentralized account, it's like everywhere, right? It's digital, it's in the internet, but it's also in any kind of virtual environment. And there's also some technical advantage to this because now you can easily add, for example, also a key that's controlled by a game, and then the game can act as you on the blockchain, while at the same time you don't have to take off your VR headset or constantly switch to your MetaMask just to do an interaction. So things are more seamless and more smooth in that way as well. So we call this all together the new creative economy, and you can also participate in that if you want to. It's about to start. We have a test network that you can join. It's like some ethereal test network, so we are restarting this a lot. We're using this for testing. It's called L15. And you can find this on docs.luxo.tech if you want to figure out how to participate in that. There's also all of these standards, the tools we're building around these standards, and all of this stuff to really, like, you know, help build this. And we have a Discord, obviously, that you can join as well. This was basically my whole talk, and we have exactly 1 minute. So if there's any question, then, you know, be quick. All right, yeah. Yes, thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you, Fabian Vogelsteller. Thank you very much.
BLOCKCHANCE 2021.